My name is Patrick Spiro, and I'm the librarian of the American Philosophical Society, and welcome to our plenary event for our conference, Women in Science, Achievements and Barriers, and this conversation is Depicting Women in Science. This conference is inspired by our museum exhibition, Pursuit and Persistence, 300 Years of Women in Science. I'm sure there have already been numerous plugs for this exhibition, and I suspect many of you have already seen it, but if you haven't, it will be open all day tomorrow and on Saturday. It's right around the corner. I got that right, Adriana? Yeah. And it's a wonderful exhibition, so I hope you all will find time to make it there. And this is first in a series of conferences. Usually the Society's library would host 2 conferences a year on different themes, but we thought that this year's exhibition and this topic is so massive and important that we dedicate the entire years of conferences to the subject. So our next conference is going to be in the fall. It's Women in Science Opportunities. And there's currently a call for papers, obviously. But that call for papers is due, the deadline is Monday. So, yeah. So you all, after this conference is over and are inspired, will spend the weekend writing. So, great. I want to make one minor comment. I was in my office. I couldn't make it for the sessions, but I was listening, and there was some discussion of the term virtuoso, and I couldn't help but be reminded of the proposal to create the American Philosophical Society in 1743, which was written by Franklin and a group of other civically minded individuals. And their first item is that it reads that one society be formed of virtuosi or ingenious men residing in the several colonies to be called the American Philosophical Society, who are to maintain a constant correspondence. And that's what we've been doing for now 280 years. But it was great to hear that reference, and it seems to confirm what the panelist was saying about the use of the term in the 18th century. I am the librarian here, and as Bob mentioned in the last session, I am leaving. And so this is my last time standing on this podium, and I think it's particularly fitting for me now to introduce someone who was one of my very first hires here, Adriana Link. And I have her formal biography, which I may read, but I think first I'll just say why I hired Adriana. Adriana received a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and when she applied, she was a postdoc at UMass. And she had this really great background. She wrote a dissertation on the history of anthropology, looking at the Smithsonian Institution in particular, but she also had a deep background in the history of science, serving on several journal boards and being very involved. She also had experience in libraries at Johns Hopkins and really seemed dedicated to a life advancing knowledge, which is exactly what we do here at the American Philosophical Society. So when we hired Adriana, there was no department called Scholarly Programs, but her title now is Head of Scholarly Programs. And she really has created this entire department and all of the activity that it does. So today, Adriana oversees a fellowship program that provides over 120 months of fellowships. And that means that the Society supports 10 years of research every single year. And she oversees that entire program. She also organizes a group of programs that are too long for me to list because you all are here to hear her moderate this panel, not me talk about her. But all I can say is that she has created a powerhouse. She has allowed the Society to grow and most importantly, I think, serve its mission of promoting useful knowledge. The programs that she's mounted has had tremendous impact in all of our fields. Even though she's a historian of science with a specialty in anthropology, she has served Native American and indigenous cultures. She has served the early American period, and she's even embraced the American Revolution, which is my own field. So she has been an incredible asset to the Society, and I can't tell you how thrilled I am to introduce her to moderate this conversation. Adriana?
Thanks so much, Patrick. That was really generous. I'm really delighted to be here. Well, I've seen all of you all afternoon already, so you already know who I am. But I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to be in conversation and mostly listen to this really stellar set of panelists who will be talking about their own projects depicting women in science. And as Patrick noted, the inspiration for this conference really is the museum exhibition. And we've been thinking a lot over the past couple of months of, the different strategies involved in telling the stories, in visualizing the stories, and also thinking about who gets left out in those conversations, and what do you do about that when you're trying to make that accessible not just to scholars, but to the public. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and then sit at this table with them and give you a chance to hear about what they're doing. So first off, we've got Serenity Sutherland, who really was a driving force behind a lot of the work that we're doing at today's conference. Serenity is Assistant Professor of Communication Studies at SUNY Oswego. She has a PhD in history and was an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in the Digital Humanities at the University of Rochester, and her research interests include the history of women in science and technology, the digital humanities, and media studies. Next to her is David Nelson, who is digital project specialist at the APS. His PhD is in Germanic languages and literature from UPenn, and in addition to his work on visualizing women in science, he's also involved in numerous other projects here at the CDS, which you can ask him about after our panel. Also joining them are Lacey Barrettle, who is an art historian whose research intersects with history of science. She holds a master's and PhD in history of art from the University of Pennsylvania, and she's taught at the University of Washington, Seattle, and Vassar College. And from 2020 until February of 2023, she served as science historian on detail at the National Portrait Gallery from the National Science Foundation. And this past March, she joined the Office of the Senate Curator, where she is an assistant curator, so more to hear about that project. Working with her was Chanel, and maybe still is, Chanel Pickens, who's the education assistant for the Smithsonian's American Women's History Museum. Her career has spanned almost 20 years, working in media, marketing, event planning, and higher education. And through her work and studies, she is interested in developing pathways of support that enhance the classroom experience, so really kind of the educational side of what we're doing. And as part of this lifelong desire of learning and teaching, she's currently pursuing her master's in English and creative writing. And then last, but certainly not least, is Jasmine Brown, who is a medical student at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a recipient of multiple awards, including the National Minority Quality Forum's 40 Under 40 Leaders in Health Award. And her story, I think, is a really interesting one. After getting a Rhodes Scholarship during her senior year at Washington University in St. Louis, she went to the University of Oxford, where she got a master's in history of science, medicine, and technology, and wrote a dissertation really focused on social and structural barriers that were put in place to prevent Black women from entering medicine in the US. And she's written a book, Twice as Hard, the stories of Black women who fought to become physicians from the Civil War to the 21st century, which she's going to tell us a little bit more about. So with that, I'm going to ask each of you in turn to give us a sense of these projects, visualizing women in science. All of you are trying to make visible the biographies, experiences, and contributions of these women who have otherwise held marginal positions within historical narratives, or as some of you have suggested, have been left out completely. So I'd love to hear each of you talk a little bit about what inspired you to take on these projects, how you developed them, what strategies you employed to visualize them, and anything else you'd like to share. So we'll start with David and Serenity.
Great, thank you. We have some slides. I think we'll stay seated and we'll just use the clicker. Or if you want to stand, we can. It's up to you. Seated is good. So as we wait for the slides to get up, I can just say that our project is entitled Visualizing Women in Science, and there is a dual meaning in this. On the one hand, the project intends to visualize connections between different women scientists. So we're looking deeply at networks of women scientists and how women scientists interact. And on the other hand, we are looking for women scientists who have been forgotten, and we're trying to find ways to make them visible again. So is it working? I love technology, it's all my job. Okay, there we are. So we know that women scientists are active in the historical record, but we know that their contributions are not always visible. They're hidden in other areas. Archival collections have a lot of evidence of the work that women scientists have done. However, this is not always apparent from the finding aid. Their material might be hidden in correspondence where other people mention them casually, or it might be hidden in correspondence about associations for women or other areas like this. So this project began in 2018 with mostly the work of my collaborator, Serenity, who will speak in a moment. But really the idea was we want to look at the collections of women scientists that we have here, and these women scientists are very well known. They're very famous, including Nobel Prize winner Barbara McClintock. But we want to see where are the other women who are there as well? Where are the other women who are helping them? There's a bit of a, sort of feminist assumption here that they're actually going to be helping other women. So we did end up surveying a lot of other collections to find additional people. We surveyed over 60 collections to find women hidden in our collections, but we did start with the core collections of women scientists. And we were looking for ways in which they were interacting. So I think with this, I'm going to turn it over to Serenity, who's going to explain more of the nuts and bolts about what we did and how it works.
Thanks, David. And David is a fantastic collaborator, as is the rest of the APS. So if you ever get a chance to come and do a fellowship, I highly recommend it. These folks are fantastic. So I worked within 6 principal collections at the APS over a couple of, I'm going to try and use this. Can you? I'll keep talking. Thank you. So these 6 collections relied on women scientists who are fairly well known throughout the 19th and 20th century, and I engaged in a process of triangulation. So trying to find who these women were referencing, who they were writing to, who they were writing letters of recommendation for, who they were publishing with, both men and women, to see what kinds of men, like we heard about in the first panel, were using their privilege to advocate for women in these spaces, and also see the ways that women formed networks amongst themselves. So we, with the help of David, came up with a set of parameters of data that we were looking for. And so this involved reading through, as much as we could, reading through every item in these collections and noting women's names and how they were connected within the letter, either to the woman whose collection it was, or to other people who were mentioned within the letter. And so you can see there the list of the key collections that we relied upon. And I hope you'll get to visit the site because you'll have more in-depth biographies there. But early on, we thought of these connections as nodes, or identifying data that would link the women together. And you can see there that these are the nodes of connection that that we relied on. And this visual here in the background shows, you can see the central node, Elizabeth Eshelman Miller, was not one of our original collections that we looked in, but this was a principal node that emerged from all of the collections that we looked at, and we could begin to see women who were connected within that, either publishing together, writing letters of recommendation for, mentoring each other. And in some cases, we did know instances of men. For example, Albert Einstein is in the collection as well as some other really well-known men. So part of our work here was to create biographies that provide more in-depth, brief but in-depth information about the women, because a lot of these women, based on the presumption that we had, were hidden and so therefore wouldn't be well known to a general audience. So we were able to find some women who, of course, are well known, have books and books and books written about them, but then women who we really had to do some digging to find information about their contributions to science. And we also had to ask ourselves, what is science? And we also had to ask ourselves, how do we define within this project what a contribution to science is? And we'll be happy to talk about that within the Q&A. But the biographies were really important in helping us see how we're bringing these women to light, whose stories we get to tell. And so I think I will turn it over to David.
Okay, and we'll see if we can, there we go. So what we, in the end, provide people with, originally I had wanted to show a video, but my technology didn't work. But you, in this network, are able to click through the different women scientists and see how they're connected to other women scientists and male scientists to a lesser extent. And this contextualizes both the well-known scientists, how were they supported by other people, how did they, in some case, exploit other people? And also, it also reveals these lesser-known people who are actually really, really fundamental to the advancement of science and what the more famous scientists were able to achieve. So with that, we're just going to briefly conclude with some takeaways, which are that what I basically just said, women are hidden in archival collections, and we can find them through looking through these famous first women, but there are other steps that need to be taken to reveal their contributions completely. And I also just want to talk a little bit about the visual nature of what we're doing, because we are using a network visualization. It's something that's very flashy visually, something that's very fun to click through. It provides a different mode of access to this. This required combing through collections. This is information that you won't find in the finding aid. It's at a deeper level than that. And so it's just a different mode of access to that. Now, one thing maybe we can talk about later is that we had to simplify this a little bit when we tried to think about how we were going to put it in the museum, because you can see a version of this in our current exhibition. So these are all things we can talk about later, but I think we've spoken more than enough, so I'm going to hand it off to the next person.
Great, thanks so much. What I was really excited about with this session is how much synergy there really was across these projects. And I think in particular, you see that with the work that Lacey and Chanel have been doing at the Smithsonian, but also with their incredible Wikipedia project. So I would love to give you an opportunity now to just tell the audience a little bit about what you've been doing in terms of making women visible in your collections.
Great. If I had a couple slides, if it's possible to pull those up, that would be great. So my name is Lacey Baradell, and as Adriana mentioned in the introduction, I, until this past February, was a science historian on detail to the Portrait Gallery for a 3-year detail, and I have left the position. I'm now at the Senate doing very different things, but as part of this detail, my responsibilities were really to highlight history of science using the Portrait Gallery's collections, also help grow and expand their collections, and then, share this work through exhibitions and public programming. I was hired in July 2020 when the museum was fully shuttered due to COVID, so you can imagine when you're on a kind of ticking timer for your 3 years and the museum's not even open, that can really change some of what you expected that you might be able to get done. I think, yeah, agree. There you go. So one of the first things I wanted to do was just understand the status of the Portrait Gallery's collection. And in the full paper, you can read a little bit more about the methodology and who is determined to be a scientist is categorized in the museum's database. But I think this is a really striking kind of visualization of the people. So this isn't the number of portraits, but this is the people represented in the museum's collection that are designated as a scientist of some type. And you can have more than one designation. So you could be a scientist and a politician. You could be a scientist and an actor. So they might have other roles as well. But of the 511 people in the museum's collections, this is as of summer 2022, only 37 were women. So that's about 7%. And then of those 37 women, only 4 were people of color. So that's less than 1%. So when I was hired to do history of science as a whole, but it became very clear to me that one area of focus is women. And, we've been talking about underrepresentation, and as an art historian, this is literally about representation. Chanel and I, though we're both at the Smithsonian, we worked on different but related projects related to portraiture, so that's what's connecting our work. But just wanted to also clarify that we're doing 2 different projects at the Smithsonian. So a few of the ways that working closely with the curatorial team, that we started to try to address some of these imbalances, of course, cannot rectify them in such a short time frame. One was a focus on acquisitions and long-term loans. And again, because women are so underrepresented in science in the museum's collection, that was an area, like personally, I didn't feel comfortable advocating that we spend money to acquire more portraits of men. And so we really made a conscious focus to seek portraits of women in science. And these are just 4 of the examples, 3 acquisitions and 1 long-term loan of Jewel Plummer Cobb at the bottom right from Rutgers University. These, in thinking through acquisitions, we took kind of 2 approaches. One was, because the Portrait Gallery is an art museum and a history museum, there are very kind of specific parameters about the artistic quality of the portrait, also the significance of the person represented. A portrait in the collection kind of has to meet both of these criteria. So one approach was to reach out to scientific organizations like the National Academies and others and try to just get tips about where can I find portraits of scientists. And then another route was to go through the artists that the museum either already collected portraits by them or just artists that I knew would kind of meet the threshold for the museum to acquire, who also represented scientists in their work. So the portrait of Mariam Mirzakhani in the upper left-hand corner is by Mariana Cook, who published 2 books of portraits, one of scientists and one of mathematicians. The second pillar was exhibitions. And again, because the museum was closed, this mostly took the form of online exhibitions. So these are just screenshots of 3 Google Arts and Culture exhibitions that I put together. And this was an opportunity to use what little we did have, but highlight it in a way that would make it very accessible to people. So at the top, Chen Wu, in the middle, Julie Packard, and then at the bottom, Maxine Singer. And then finally, through public programs, I organized a Zoom conversation in March 2022 that brought together a contemporary artist, Amanda Phingpo de Pakia, and 2 historians of science, Anna Razor and Layla McNeil, who you may, if you know of Lady Science, they were the editors behind that, to really talk about a lot of the themes of this panel and the previous one, honestly, about visibility and invisibility, and what are the challenges of the historical archive, and what can we do to ensure that those challenges don't perpetuate into the future. So I think that's a good segue into Chanel's work.
Thanks for that, Lacey. So it's really important to note, as Lacey said, we are all part of the Smithsonian Institution, but our work is very pan-institutional by nature. So obviously the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum is not actually a physical thing yet. So we work across the institution just to cull the collections and find different ways to amplify the voices and the stories of women and girls throughout American history. So this project was a really unique opportunity for us to not just do that in a way through just a scientific lens, but also thinking about an educational lens. So I think, oh, great, there's that. So our open knowledge coordinator, Kelly Doyle Kim, does this work across the institution. So it's really important to note that this Wikipedia project that we did is just a very small portion of what we're doing across the Smithsonian. She's actually really involved with many Wikipedia editathons, which we can talk about a little bit later. But just one aspect of this is just trying to find a way to get more women's images added to the profiles on Wikipedia. So I've got just some statistics for you. These are in the paper, but I think it's really important to highlight this information. So since 2020, over 4 million images have been released through the Smithsonian's open access policy. It's a lot of images, but these are primarily historic images. So what we're trying to do is amplify the voices of contemporary women, contemporary scientists. We've been talking a lot about visibility and invisibility. It's so great that we're having this discussion following the last panel, because if you're a young person and you're interested in becoming a scientist, it's helpful to see someone that might look look like you or be from a community that's represented as your own. More important data here, Wikipedia has more than 10 billion with a B views per month across all their language versions, but in its English language version, less than 20% of biographies are about women, and less than 10% of contributors are women. So if you just kind of think about what that means, that's a much smaller number than is probably appropriate. And part of this is due to copyright restrictions. So an element of our project, which you can read more about in the paper, was trying to educate people on the importance of open access and free rights images. Not many people are familiar with that, surprisingly, right? But being able to educate people on how there are certain parameters and restrictions necessary for you to follow in order to post an image of yourself to an existing Wikipedia profile page. As much as I might like to write my own profile and talk about how fabulous I am and post my image, that will be taken down immediately. So it's important that people that are participating in these types of activities are really familiar with the open access policies of that. One of the things that we hope to accomplish with this is by taking a micro crowdsourcing approach, we can take this very big task and break it down into kind of smaller pieces. So what we've got here, maybe. Oh, nope, I went back too far. We're gonna go back. Oh. There we go. So this is an example of a selfie. I think everyone in here is very familiar with what a selfie is. But again, going back to those policies and parameters, you can't just take a picture of yourself mugging it up. You have to make sure that the background does not have anything that might be copywritten in it. You actually have to take the photo yourself. So as much as I might like my new friend Jasmine here to take my photo, she would be the copyright owner in that situation. So we wouldn't be able to upload that and say, this is Chanel's photo. There would be some whole process for you to give me those permissions, and nobody has time for that. So it's much better if I take the photo myself and then upload it to Wikimedia Commons. So it's important to note that the Wikimedia platform includes Wikipedia, the Wikimedia Commons, which is where you can upload images, and then Wikidata. There are Wikimedians across the board. This is an example of one. This is actually Mia. She started as an intern at the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative and is now actually working very closely with Kelly Doyle Kim. So she's provided us with an example of what this would look like if you were to upload your own selfie. One really important thing to note about our project was that we wanted to make education central to what we do. So as Adriana mentioned, my background is in education, so I have a degree in library and information science, teach, do the whole nine, and I'm very aware of how many learners start their research. It's on Wikipedia. We would all love to say they're starting on a library database, but we know that's not always true. And you know what? That's okay, because in the 22 years of Wikipedia, it's more than proven to be an excellent starting point to be able to have these conversations. So if we're talking about inclusion, if we're talking about visibility and accessibility, we have to meet learners where they are. So what we decided to do was actually develop an infographic because of the nature of this screen. I didn't put that up there, but we've got a wonderful QR code that you are welcome to scan. It will actually take you to Wikimedia Commons, where you can download. We created 2 versions of this. So when we did the project, it was for Women's History Month this year, but we have posted both versions of those, but there's a general version that you're welcome to use as well. But it takes you through the process of taking a photo, uploading it to the Commons, describing it, and then putting it out there into the ether, basically, for our Wikimedians to grab and then attach to your profile. It's really a 4-step process. I think we'll talk a little bit more about, maybe later, about some of the obstacles we faced. But again, a big part of this is just educating people. You need to have a Wikipedia account. It's not a difficult thing to do. We can all do this, right? You need to take the photo yourself. You need to have a background that's basically blank, and then upload it and describe it. So our hope in doing something with the micro crowdsourcing approach is that we can distribute something as simple as an infographic to all of you, and then you can share it with your networks, because I think we all probably know individuals who could be represented more visibly on Wikipedia through these efforts, and then be able to have their information distributed in that manner. I think we'll talk about this a little bit more about some opportunities and things, so yeah.
We'll get there. But I want to make sure we get Jasmine in on this conversation too, and I think that this is a really nice segue. So Jasmine, you haven't created a massive data visualization like some of our friends here, but you are a medical student, and you do have a background in history of science. And when I was thinking about this program, I discovered your book, which is, where is it now on Amazon? Where is it on the charts?
I don't know where
It's pretty high up there, though. It's so you've somehow found another way to connect with the public through writing this really fantastic trade book. And I would love to hear from you about your experience as somebody who's navigating both medical school and why you decided to write this book while doing. I didn't go to medical school. I can't even imagine where you found time to write a book. I'm having a hard time in my book, but I'd love to hear, what inspired that process and how has that changed your approach to your own career as a woman who is going into the medical field?
Yeah, so I don't have slides, but I will read a short excerpt from my book, which was published by Beacon Press a few months ago, titled Twice as Hard, The Stories of Black Women Who Fought to Become Physicians from the Civil War to the 21st Century. The research for my book began in 2018. After being awarded a Rhodes Scholarship, I moved to the UK to complete a master's in history of science, medicine, and technology. My plan was to complete my dissertation on the social and structural barriers put in place to prevent Black women from entering medicine in the US. Up to that point, I had many encounters with prejudice in the science and medical communities. Either I or another student of color was the target of this maltreatment. I wanted to understand why micro and macroaggressions permeated these communities. There was limited literature looking at the experience of physicians who were both Black and a woman, so it seemed like studying the unique barriers of physicians with these intersecting identities would be a worthwhile project for me to pursue. But as I dug deeper into this research, the focus of my project began to shift. I was sitting in my cramped dorm room in Oxford, listening to a voice resonating through my laptop. It transported me to the other side of the world, back home. It said, after I got a taste of this thing of college, then I had to have more of the same. Now, my only fear there was that I could not possibly make enough money with my mother to go into the next year. So I decided to make as much of that year as I could, so that I could at least say that I had 2 years of college, or 3 years of college. The sound of Dr. May Chen's voice seemed so familiar. It felt as though she was one of my great-grandmothers. Dr. Chen and I were born 100 years apart, and she passed away 40 years ago. Still, her voice bent through time and touched my soul. I could imagine us sitting on a pillowy couch in a cozy living room, both sipping a hot cup of English breakfast tea as she told me her life story. She bravely hurdled over the challenges of being a Black woman entering the unwelcoming field of medicine in the early 20th century. And she came out on the other side in triumph, as a skilled physician who made a huge impact in her patients' lives. May Chen was born in 1896 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Neither her mother, Lulu Ann, nor her father, William Lafayette Chen, had a college education. They represented the vast majority of African Americans at the time who were not allowed to attain an education. May's father had been born into slavery. He seized his freedom at 11 years old when he bravely ran away from the Chen plantation in Virginia. May's mother, Lulu, was born in 1876, 13 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. So she never had to endure life as a slave, but she did work as a servant for a white family who moved from Virginia to Massachusetts. Lulu was determined to lead her daughter down a different path. She believed that a strong education would give May an easier life, but the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case was decided a month after May was born. The ruling codified racial segregation laws in numerous societal institutions, including the education system. This left May to be taught at schools that were deprived of educational resources and adequate government funding. Despite these challenges, Lulu did what she could to support her child. Her encouragement led May to get her undergraduate degree from Teachers College at Columbia University and her medical degree from NYU School of Medicine as the school's first Black female graduate. After clearing one hurdle, Dr. Chen immediately faced another. Following graduation, she experienced intense racial discrimination. Residency programs refused to admit her. Hospitals refused to hire her. Sadly, the vast majority of Black physicians at the time faced this form of discrimination. But Dr. Chen was not deterred. To further her medical training, she worked for a group of male physicians in New York City. Eventually, she left the group and opened her own practice. For many years, she was the only Black woman physician in Harlem, where she focused on serving Black patients who refused care from hospitals due to racial segregation. Some of these patients needed surgery. In these situations, Dr. Chen teamed up with Dr. Peter Marshall-Murray, a trained surgeon from Howard University College of Medicine. Dr. Chen described her medical practice as reminiscent of practices 100 years before. When these two African-American doctors entered a patient's home, they carefully surveyed the space. They needed to figure out how they were going to adapt the area for an antiseptic surgery. Depending on the size of the patient, they designated a bed or an ironing board as their operating table. Then, the doctors would wrap up their surgical dressings in newspaper and bake them in the patient's coal stove. In less time than it took to bake a loaf of bread, the dressings were sterilized and relatively safe to use. While the dressings were undergoing this process, the doctors went to another part of the patient's home, the washroom. Here, they used the patient's wash boiler, which usually washed clothes, in order to disinfect their surgical instruments. With everything set up, Dr. Chen would administer the anesthesia. Once the patient was induced, Dr. Murray would start the surgery. Throughout the procedure, the patient's grandmother or another family member would serve as their nurse. Once the surgery was done, the two doctors took turns watching over the patient. They were both on call until the patient was able to get up. With some help and a heap of innovation, these doctors were accomplishing the remarkable feat of providing care for patients who have been discarded by the medical system. As someone who spent 3 months in the operating room while on my surgery clerkship rotation, I find this story awe-inspiring. Racism and sexism woven into the fabric of our society led members of the medical community to try to deprive Dr. May Chen of proper medical training. Then, they turned their backs on countless Black patients who would die without medical care. But Dr. Chen persevered through these harsh conditions and used ingenuity to provide medical care for patients in need. Dr. Chen is one of 9 Black women physicians highlighted in my book. Their experiences span the more than 150 years of Black women physicians practicing in America. The women in my book are only a small sampling of the immense cohort of Black women physicians who've overcome great barriers with the aim of making a positive impact on their patients' lives and in the medical community. In the midst of my medical journey, I think about these incredible Black women physicians and feel so grateful that they paved this path for me. With my book, I'm not just constructing a history. I set out to inspire future generations of Black women and other minorities who will pursue medicine, creating a new class of role models in the women whose histories I share. As Twice as Hard shows, overcoming racism and sexism to become doctors was a monumental feat in and of itself. But beyond this, the physicians in this book made significant contributions to medicine and healthcare, and this new work establishes a lineage of Black women doctors whose accomplishments are undeniably important and inspirational. Black women physician stories have gone untold for far too long, leaving gaping holes in American history and medical history. And Twice as Hard, I'll set the record straight.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. And this is actually something that I wanted the whole panel to touch on a little bit as well, which is how can we use projects like the ones that David and Serenity are working, that Chanel and Lacey are working on, and of course your book, to confront these legacies and these biases within the collections and within the histories that we write about. So maybe expanding on Jasmine's story, I don't know, David, Serenity, do you want to add anything to this conversation? And then Chanel and Lacey.
This is a really great question, and thank you so much for sharing your excerpt. That was really powerful and moving. we did certainly encounter this within the project that we were working on, and we didn't get to show you all of it. So one area we didn't get to show you is an area called data stories on the site, where you can go and really drill down into the data. And one of the data stories that we discovered was exactly about this question of what's hidden, what's excluded, and has to do with a drawing of a Henrietta Lacks cell that we found when we were going through the archival materials. And so this very much answers that question of what is hidden, what is excluded, and I hope you can get a chance to check it out. We don't have a visual of it, but hopefully you can check it out on your own. That these are very much the types of stories that we wanted to tell within the archive, because the archive is a source of power. It is a source of whose stories get to be highlighted and whose stories get to be told. But there are tools. They're what we have. And so when we're working thoughtfully and carefully with these tools, those kinds of stories can come out and can be highlighted in unique ways in these kinds of projects.
Also, just to add on to that, one thing that we discovered, particularly in the Florence Sabin papers, is that very often women who were not as privileged tended to be hidden in ways that we didn't expect. For instance, we discovered the story of Consuelo Vadillo, who is a Mexican gynecologist who came to the United States to study gynecology, and who went back to Mexico to establish one of the first hospitals in the Yucatan to treat women patients really successfully. And her correspondence was not on a folder with her name on it. It was with a folder of the names of American women, of white American women. And we uncovered actually several examples of this, where women of color were hidden in ways that we didn't necessarily expect. And so one of the things we tried to do with our project was to really pull out all of the names that we could, so that these names couldn't be hidden anymore and that their stories could be uncovered.
I think one thing that this is reminding me of is that, I showed that graph of the 511 scientists in the collection, but there were hidden women in that that I didn't even know until essentially right before I left my position. And by that I mean that the way that and this maybe also touches on previous conversations about information, but the way that we categorize in the databases is really significant. One work in particular is by a contemporary artist named Ora Satz, and it's a time-based media piece in which it's called Her Luminous Distance, and it's about about early women working in astronomy in the United States. So it has Maria Mitchell, it has Henrietta Swan Leavitt, two very well-known women in this field in the 19th century and early 20th century. The work is cataloged in the museum database under their names, and it had never been shown at the museum. It will be installed this July, so I'm really excited to see it. But I was able to see, as part of the conservation treatment that the work was having done before it goes on view, there were scans of all of these slides that are flickered, like projected onto the wall as the work, and it's just kind of this random loop, and it has this pulsing soundtrack, and it's a really fascinating piece. But I noticed that there were actually some of the images that rotate through. They're not all portraits. There are images of stars and lunar craters and these women's, handwritten annotations on glass plate slides. But some of the pictures had groups of women, including the human computers that were working at the Harvard Observatory, and they just weren't named in the database. So you couldn't go to a portrait search and find them. They weren't in my data that I had. And so one of the very last things I did was put their names forward for the historical review. It's like an internal process that the museum does, so that their names could be added, the ones that we could know. Some of them we weren't able to identify. Their names could be added to the object label and then would be searchable on the museum's website. So you would be able to find that these women are in fact represented.
And I'll just very quickly say discovery is absolutely key. But another part of this is communication. At the beginning of this conference, I had a wonderful conversation with my new friend, Claire Parkinson back there in the corner. But part of that communication is celebrating wins, right? I was so geeked as Claire was doing her presentation to Google her and see that you not only have a Wikipedia page with a wonderful photo, you're also represented in Wikidata, which is really important. But then you also notice those gaps. So I learned today about Helen Coley-Knotts, who is not represented on Wikipedia, but she is mentioned in her dad's full profile page with his photo. There's a couple of images of her. So finding those opportunities to tell those stories, all of us do the research, and then being able to contribute in a meaningful way in various ways so different people can find that information.
So I want to make sure that we have some time for questions from the audience, but maybe I'll ask each of you very quickly to say one takeaway, challenge, lesson that you learned from doing the projects that you've talked about today. So I'll start with you, Jasmine, and then we'll work down this way. So,
one of the challenges that I faced, because these women were largely hidden, was how do I find them in the archive? And I didn't talk so much about my methods, but I had to do a creative approach. Like initially I tried the more standard primary resources such as newspaper clippings, but particularly in the late 1900s, early 20th century, Black women physicians weren't being highlighted in newspapers, for instance. They weren't seen as their accomplishments being important enough to highlight in that way. So my primary resource ended up being oral histories. And it was really powerful for me because as I mentioned here, I'm literally hearing these women's voices, some of whom have passed away. But I think it was also powerful because it allowed them to create their own narrative about their lives as opposed to other people's narratives. And for my master's, I feel like that research method wasn't seen at the same level as other more traditional primary resources, but for these more marginalized people from marginalized communities, they're not typically highlighted in those spaces. And so I think even considering what we weigh as appropriate or significant scholarly pursuit or resources.
no, that's great. We were talking a lot earlier about credibility and what sort of sources get privileged in these conversations. And I don't know, any takeaways, last words of wisdom from you?
I would just say that for my project, a challenge was just resources in terms of time and money. I was on a 3-year detail. Chanel's position is also a term position, and that's common through a lot of the American Women History Initiative positions. So, these are priorities, but what's the long-term sustainability if we're not creating permanent positions and putting I didn't have a dedicated budget to acquire photographs of scientists, right? I had to work. I wasn't even technically in the curatorial team that controls that budget. So I could advocate as much as I want, but I didn't actually have the purchasing power.
I'd say 2 things. Education, being very thoughtful about embracing both formal and informal systems of education, and then also institutional buy-in. It's really important that if you're going to undertake any kind of project, as you all know, and I think another group is speaking on later, you have to have very real institutional buy-in if it's going to be sustainable and impactful.
I think one challenge for the visualization is that it's limited to what's here in the archives, which is also an affordance of it, that it's one way to understand more about this specific archival offerings. But a lot of the great women in science who have been mentioned today are not in the visualization because they haven't shown up in the archive. So in a lot of ways, that's a challenge and a limitation of scope, which when I originally started the project, I was like, I'll find all the women ever and I'll just put them online and it will be so easy. I didn't think it would be easy, but I certainly didn't realize that it was going to be quite so, it's a real project to even focus just on one archival collection. So that was certainly a challenge that I learned.
Yeah, and one challenge that I'll say is that these women who history hasn't deemed important enough to get their own collections, to have their own papers preserved. We can actually find out an awful lot about them from the papers of other people, which is what our project attempts to do, but it's really hard work. We showed the visualization earlier of Elizabeth Eshelman Miller, who did her dissertation with Florence Siebert, whose papers we have, and we thought, oh wow, look at her, she's so important, all these women she's working with. Well, I was going through the papers of Mildred Cohn, and I kept on seeing Elizabeth Miller, Elizabeth Miller, Elizabeth Miller. No correspondence with her. Nothing. It's the same person. And, you can tell so much with these two papers about that, but the fact that her name is being different in about the two places, that we didn't get a folder for her in Mildred Cohn papers, that just made it really hard to put all of the pieces together and to figure out actually how much we could actually say about her.
So I'd love to hear from the audience, and I think Thomas has got a microphone. So if anybody has questions for any of our panelists, or go ahead.
Thank you so much. That's a really great panel. It's fascinating. I have a question for Jasmine. Who were the oral historians, or who, maybe they weren't oral historians, who collected the oral histories that you listened to, and where was that collection?
There was the Schellinger Library, I think that's the name, at Radcliffe College. That was one set of archives. They have the Black Women's Oral History Project, and so a subset of those were physicians. That was the most concrete or put together collection that I could find. A lot of other things following breadcrumbs, one mentor saying, oh, I think there's an archive in Arkansas. So I found an archive in Arkansas that actually was very detailed, the manuscript, oral, and also even some video of the women, which was really cool. But that collection focused on women who had graduated from University of Arkansas's medical school. I did some oral histories myself as well for more contemporary women, and that was even a project learning how do I do an oral history, what are the paperwork that I need to do. But yeah, I would say the Schellinger Library and the University of Arkansas's collection were the most detailed and put together archives that I found.
I'm wondering if learning, just identifying the existence of many of these forgotten and invisible women, as you put it, has led you to try to recover more information, more papers, more, more to add them to the archives. And if so, has that been at all successful? I mean, that's another way to make people visible, I should think.
Maybe I can start here. This was one of the things we tried to do, and I guess we're going to have to judge how successful it was. So we did, in our visualization, allow people to filter via collection so that you could identify the information. The biographies we wrote, we, in many cases, could not rely only on the information in our collections because they were too sparse. So we did have to go to a lot of different sources and try to pick up what are the traces of what these people left behind. I think there's still a lot of work that we could do to try to find who else has traces of them, but we view our project as a starting point to finding more information about these people. We did what we could. There's a lot more to do.
And I'll just say that I really want to thank Michelle in her earlier panel about the question about agency and how that is connected to these ideas of being visible and invisible, and even the way in which we talk about finding these women in the archive. They've always been, there, and so telling their stories using the idea of recovery, that's all part of this conversation as well.
I think my experience working in a portraiture museum is very raised a lot of these questions about what you do, because there are possibilities to portraiture, but also limitations, right? You need a portrait. So I can't go find a trace in an archive and put that up on the wall at a portrait museum. So one thing that the museum has been kind of experimenting with thinking through, is posthumous portraiture, commissioning contemporary artists to create portraits of people whose portraits either were never made or do not survive, so that we can tell those stories. Someone mentioned Henrietta Lacks recently. Her portrait was created for the Portrait Gallery. This was before my time, so I was not involved in that project. Again, it's a matter of resources, though. Portraits are expensive.
Jasmine or Chanel, anything? No?
So I haven't added to the archive, but with my book, I was really intentional, and this was actually from advice from other historians of like making sure that I had a detailed works cited pages at the back of my book so that the resources were more easily like, this is where I found them. So for other people wanting to research this topic, it wouldn't take as long as it took me to find them.
Great. Oh, we have more questions now. Okay. We'll go a little longer, so we'll get the...
Hi, thanks everybody. That's great. This is probably mainly to Serenity and David, but if anyone else wants to jump in, please do. I've been involved in creating a website, and it's great, and you have this wonderful resource, and you've got an amazing resource. I love it. But do you know who's using it, how they're using it? What's your strategy in terms of raising the profile of this, getting users to engage with it, and kind of in the long term, because the website I was involved in, we're now having to completely redo it because it's 10 years old and it looks really dated. So is there funding and a long-term strategy in relation to what you're doing? I mean, you've obviously got the exhibition going on at the moment, which is fantastic to publicize it, but how do you know what's going to happen? Because I think there's a big danger with all these things we're all doing, that we all think they're great, we all tell each other about them, but are we getting any traction beyond this community? Thanks.
That's a really great question about sustainability of these projects. And I think that in terms of who's using it, I don't know the exact specific numbers of that. We will know that soon because we're going to be talking about it at a different conference. But that gets to your second question of how do we let people know about this I think David and I have been presenting on it a lot and talking to a lot of people about it. And I hope that the exhibition is getting a lot of attention as well to the project. But I really appreciate your question about these digital sources and what are we going to do with them and how are we going to preserve this knowledge? And I think it's certainly one that we're grappling with, and I'm grateful for the APS being a very long-standing tradition that this is something that is housed at the APS and will continue.
Yeah, I'm not going to say very much other than this is a really good question, and this is not totally relevant to the theme of the topic, but as a web developer, I always think about the fact that my time is finite. Our institution's resources are finite. I try to build things that are not going to break, and I can do that as a web developer. Other people don't have the resources to do that, and so that's a bit of privilege. But this is a conversation we'll be having in 5 years, when these women, some of the women in the network are dying. We have to update their biographies, and that takes ongoing, sustained effort. It's an institutional question where the institution has to say, this is something that we want to put money behind, that we want people to actually be able to continually update. And it's a question that's always going to be ongoing.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then come to a close.
It's possible this was already answered, so apologies. I have a question about the Wikipedia project. I'm curious if a survey was done to find out the gaps in terms of the requests, for selfies. Yeah, what were the gaps if a survey was done, and why this request? Because sorry to say that I find Wikipedia to be a rabbit hole, or the internet period. So, if people are uploading things, where is this going?
Everywhere. No. That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. Actually, this work goes back many, many years. Dr. Vicky Funk was a botanist and a curator with the National Museum of Natural History, and we had started a list of women that were associated with the museum and outside of all the Smithsonian Institution. And her daughter actually saw her Wikipedia page built from that list, and she became a major proponent for this kind of work. So there's now a funk list, as it's called, of women's profile pages that either need to be built or need to be expanded upon. So that's part of the work that we do through our Wikipedia edit-a-thons, is to tackle those projects. But for this individual project, we actually worked with our curators to identify scientists and people within the arts as well who were already represented across the Smithsonian, and it kind of touched a little bit on what Lacey was saying. A lot of these people are already represented, but in a very minimal way. So we started kind of small with this. This was just a pilot. We're kind of seeing how this can adapt further. There are significant gaps in the Smithsonian's collections, right? We have an incredible collection of very diverse stories, but once you start to dig into it, you do see those gaps. A big part of this is working with communities to identify what are the stories that haven't been told, who are the people who might be in our collection that we need to highlight further.
So I love these questions because they're a great segue for tomorrow morning's panel, which is on research strategies. So I hope you'll come back tomorrow. We started around 9. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our panelists for a really fantastic conversation.